So we have with us Carlos Fernando Avenancio-León. He is an assistant professor of finance for the Ratty School of Management at the University of California, San Diego. His work focuses on the determinants of group inequality, including the effects of political or financial mechanisms in perpetuating inequalities across race, gender, and former incarceration status. Prior to his position at UCSD, he worked at Indiana University Bloomington and received his PhD from Cal Berkeley. So it is just a little after 12 right now, and he's going to present, and then we'll have time for questions. And we have him until the end of the program, scheduled until 12:45. But if we need to take a few more questions, we have the time to do that also. So Carlos, welcome, and look forward to hearing from you.
Chris, thank you for the invitation, and thank you everyone for being here. So today I want to talk to you about property taxation, and in particular, the systemic inequality that arises from this system. So throughout the presentation, I know you guys have opportunity to ask at the end, but if you feel you want to make any clarifying question, please feel to interrupt at any time. So this what I'm talking about is part of a study that I did with my colleague Drew Howard. He's at the University of Utah. And what we started thinking about is, if you look at the historical record, there's evidence that back at the beginning of the 20th century, there was intention of using property tax records to expropriate expropriate land out of Black communities. And what we were asking ourselves is whether or not this system that in its inception was had an intentionally discriminatory purpose, whether or not that is still reflected in the way property taxes are administered today. And you think back, very big picture, you think about other forms of taxation, we have that the main forms of taxation in the United States are sales, income, and property tax. And if you go to the same store, you have two people and make the same purchase, it would be very, very strange if you see that these people pay different taxes because they have different personal traits. What we do in this paper is ask whether or not if we hold property taxes fixed, we're holding property tax fixed. We're not saying that the property taxes are different. If you hold property tax fixed, that you still have racial and ethnic minorities paying a higher property tax burden. And what we find is that, yes, even now in the 21st century, that's still an inequality that is baked into the system. After we have documented that carefully, and I will tell you the challenges that go through in documenting this, we dig down into what are the particular components that drive this inequality. And what I will tell you is that there's a component that is a neighborhood component, and there's a component that is going to be individual component. By that I mean, if the neighborhood is largely a minority, they will have a large property tax. But if you are Black and you live in a white neighborhood, you also will face a higher tax burden. And then in the worst situation would be a person that is both Black in a minority neighborhood. And then if we have time, I will offer a potential solution for avoiding this. I don't think at this point we need that much motivation for why this is important, but I just want to remark that this has large implications for the wealth gap that we see between minority and majority communities, and also relates to the problems that we have been uncovering lately in academia about how algorithmic bias and statistical bias perpetuates institutional discrimination and systemic discrimination. And I will talk about that in a little bit second. Before I tell you about the results, I want to go over how the property tax administration system works, because this is key for understanding how inequality arises. So if you think about inequality, we have to think about how people pay taxes. You can start very tautological about this. You can say that the property tax that a person pays is going to be the policy tax rate, the 5%, for example, tax rate that you have in a place, times the market value of the home. And that will be the same for two different people. The problem is that's not how it works in practice. So in practice, what happens is that you will have an assessment of the value of the property, because since you're not taxing at the moment where the home is taxed, like in a sales tax, you have to have an assessment, and the assessment is what is going to be determining what is the taxation that you're going to have. The problem with that is once you have introduced assessments into the equation, you can generate variation. So even if you have the same tax for everybody, you can have different assessments for different parties. So now the effective tax rate that you pay does not only depend on the policy tax rate, the statutory tax rate that is written in the law, but also in this assessment ratio. What is the ratio between the assessment that that your house is determined to have and the real market value of the property? So in this case, if you have an assessment that is too high relative to the value of your market value of your property, you're overpaying. And conversely, if your property is very valued, but it's assessed at a lower rate, you will be underpaying taxes. So importantly, what we are saying here is that variation in the assessment ratio, this assessment to market value ratio, is enough, is sufficient for generating inequality, even if you hold your property tax rates the same. So in this paper, in this study, what we do is the following. We focus on assessment ratios, and we focus on properties that are in the same taxing jurisdictions. By that, I mean properties that are in the same place with the same intended level of taxation, the same level of public good, I mean school districts, utility districts, everything, and the same assessment practices. So you have the same assessor offices using the same methods, using the same statutory rules for having that assessment practice. Now, this is extremely challenging because local governments are very spatially complex in doing this. You can have your county, but your county may overlap with a city, that may overlap with a school district, and that may overlap with a utility district. And then that may overlap in many ways. We have like thousands of potential combinations on this. So we take all these potential governments and we define them carefully so that we make sure that we are only comparing properties within the same set of intended taxation and intended amenities of public good provision. Once we have that, we form assessment ratios. We use data on the price of all properties that have been sold. So we have annual, we have observed transaction for 53 million properties, and we have annual assessment for over 100 million homes. And using those two, we can actually construct assessment ratios. And then we actually take that data and we merge it with data that contains homeowner race and homeowner ethnicity. This is the well-known HAMDA records. And then the objective that we had in mind is showing that there's variation in the assessment ratio by racial composition. So let me show you how this looks. So if this is Philadelphia, if you have no inequality in Philadelphia, the map of taxation, this is a heat map, this heat map will look like this, very boring, just flat. But this is not actually how the assessment ratio looks in practice. This is the realized assessment ratio. So you will see that in some areas of Philadelphia, here in the center and in the west, you will see that there's actually more, the assessment ratios are higher. So the assessments are higher relative to the market value. And in some other areas, this assessment ratio is actually quite low. So now, just visually, we can compare how this looks to the demographics of Philadelphia. And without doing any analysis, we are just like plotting the raw data of how Philadelphia looks. You can immediately see that there's a pattern, that areas that have a higher population of Black and Hispanic residents are going to be the same ones that are going to be overpaying. I can show you another example, Cook County, one of the largest counties in the United States, home to Chicago. You see the same heat map. You see in the center, there's a high assessment ratios, and that overlaps almost one-to-one with the demographics of the area. So now, yes.
Just a quick clarifying question: Are the little lines signifying census tracts?
Exactly. So in this case, yes, the census tract. That's correct.
All right. Thank you.
And census tract is not exactly what we want right now. So what we are going to do the analysis of something larger jurisdiction, then we'll do census tract and block group to actually show you even more. But yes, in this case, that is what is happening. Now, when we actually take this like visual analysis and make it rigorous, we find that overall for the whole United States, Blacks and Hispanics pay between 10 and 13% more in taxes than white counterparts. That translates to between 300 and 390 annually for the median minority homeowner. And in some extremes, you will see that this reaches almost $800 and sometimes $1,000 more annually. So this is quite a large burden. We decompose this into two channels. We say that there's going to be a special channel, and that means that some neighborhoods are going to be paying more than others. And what we show here is that this is an algorithmic problem in large part. Assessments are not responsive enough to local characteristics of a neighborhood. For example, if you live close to amenities like transportation, that is valuable for the market, but assessments are not reflecting that to the same degree. The other component would be a homeowner component. It means that if you are a minority person in a white neighborhood, you will still pay more taxes. If you are a white person in a minority neighborhood, you will also pay more than a white in a white neighborhood. But the worst situation is when you have a minority person living in a largely minority neighborhood, because in that case, they pay because they live in a highly minority neighborhood because they themselves are minorities. So these components are roughly split roughly in half. The slightly larger one is the between neighborhood components. So like the attributes of the neighborhood are going to be affecting 6 to 7% of this total 10 to 13% that we document. And the rest is going to be driven by individual attributes of the person. After we actually document those channels, we show that there's a potential policy fix that is quite easy to implement. And the way we do it, the policy fix I'm just showing here is not the best policy fix. It's just a sufficient policy fix to say that this is feasible. So local governments have better data and have more information than the one that any outsider will have. So they actually can improve on this. But what I'm saying is, if we use only publicly available data outside what county assessors have, it is feasible to actually introduce an algorithm that can correct for this inequality. And I will show that later on. Yeah. So just like just starting a little bit onto how we do this, I think an important concept to understand improper taxation is that right now in the United States, residential property taxes are ad valorem. What does that mean? That means that the value of the assessment has to be done proportionally to the fair market value of the home. This is not a trivial thing that I just can assume. In the past, we have had cost basis property taxation, where property taxes were levied relative to the cost that it was to build a home, for example. That is not the case anymore. So if I look at this Georgia code, which is representative of most codes in the United States, it states that, except as otherwise provided in this code section, taxable tangible property shall be assessed at 40% of its fair market value and shall be taxed accordingly 40% of the property's fair market value. So the first thing to notice in this excerpt is the fair market value, which is the ad valorem component. That allows me to actually compare assessment ratios with the real transacted prices. But there's a second thing that I need to emphasize here, is that in most places in the United States, the taxation won't be levied against the 100% of the value of the property. So it's not 100%. Here it's only at 40%. And this 40% changes from place to place. The natural just tax the whole value of the property is less common. What is more common is to have places that tax 10% of the property or tax 33% of the property or 40% in this case. And this adds a complication. We need to make sure that when we are comparing, making our analysis, we are comparing relative to the same amount of intended target taxation. In this case, it's the 40%. So let me show you an example of how this works. In practice, you will have a policy rate. That's what is disclosed, what is the tax rate is. So you can say, I will tax 5% of the value of your property. But in addition to that, the local governments have what is called a target assessment ratio. That is, they are going to tax 5%, but only up to 40% of the value of the home. So if you have a home that is valued $200,000 and another is valued $400,000, the accurate assessment will be only 40% of that. So it will be $80,000 and $160,000. And the tax bill will be 5% of that $80,000 or 5% of that $160,000. Then when you take the assessment ratio, which is the assessment over the home value, that's 0.4 as it was intended. And the effective tax rate is not the policy rate of 5%. It's going to be lower. It's going to be 2%. Now, what happens if the assessments are done incorrectly? So now, if you see this lower value home assessed at $85,000 and the higher value home to $150,000, then the assessment ratio changes. So now you have that the low value home is over-assessed relative to the target assessment ratio, and the other one is under-assessed relative to the target assessment ratio. And notice that the effective rate that they are paying is different. Now you see this low value home paying only over 2.2%, and the other one is paying 1.9. So this is what is generating actually our inequality. So I told you that there's several challenges that we have in this analysis. So we have must take into account that the intended level of taxation is the same. So that policy rate has to be the same. The public goods, whether or not you have access to schools or you have access to utilities or access to a particular level of like or park or all the amenities that are taken into account, that should be whole constant. And that will create over 75,000 potential taxing entities in the United States because you have overlaps of counties and cities and like and utility districts and so on. And you have to take into account also the annual changes in this taxation. The second challenge is that, as I told you before, you have the policy rate, but you also have this target assessment ratio that varies from place to place. So we need to also hold that fixed. And once we do that, we can actually understand, interpret what the results of the inequality we have. So what is going to be a taxing jurisdiction? I mentioned it a few times, but I'd like to give the visual. If you have, for example, a county, a city, and a school district, you will have here 4 potential taxing jurisdictions. You will have a jurisdiction where only the county taxes. You can have a jurisdiction where both the county and the city tax. You can have a jurisdiction where only the county and the school district taxes, or you can have a jurisdiction where everybody is taxing. And those are going to be different. So if you have home in each of these, I'm going to be comparing only homes that are subject to the same level of taxation. So now, once I have all that in place and we actually put the data, we put assessment data from Atom, it's a large data provider, and we use like race and ethnicity data from HAMDA and demographic data from ACS. This is like a common public data set. We can actually create an analysis. An important detail about timing, if you have, how do we carry through the race in an analysis? We're going to use the race at a mortgage origination. So that's like the HAMDA data contains race of mortgage origination. We know when the property is sold first, and then we see when the property is sold again. So at this time too, we have already the race because we have the race at the beginning. Now we see when the race is of the seller happens at the second transaction. And then we can compare it against the most recent assessment. So we can take this mortgage market transaction, the assessment that happened more recently, and tie together to the race of the previous owner, that who's going to be actually the seller of this property. we have that in place. Now what we want to see is compare whether or not the race of that person that owned the property is going to be in some way related to the assessment ratio that the property will have. And remembering that higher assessment ratio means you have to pay more in taxes. So if we have an equitable system where everybody pays the same, this coefficient in this analysis should be 0. It means like race has nothing to do with the assessment ratio. And if in the opposite, if this is not 0, then we're rejecting that the tax system is equitable. And this is important this is not only in a statistical artifact, this is important also from the perspective of housing law. In housing law, the standard applies here is whether or not there's disparate impact in the administration of property tax. And what we will find if we reject equitability is that actually there's a disparate impact. And that's what we find. This is the main result that we have. We show that a Black mortgage holder, the Black seller, is going to be paying 13% more. It will have an assessment ratio which is 13% larger. And if you include Black and Hispanics, that effect is a little bit smaller, but it's still significantly larger, almost 10%. And this, we can see how this distributes across states. There's large variation across states. There's large variation also across counties. And you see, for example, that the state with the largest inequality is Illinois. And then you have other states like Virginia, like Massachusetts is over here. In Indiana, you have it in the other extreme where there's actually no inequality. For most states, there's large levels of inequality. Only some states that have some characteristics, like typically more homogeneous, like they have systems that are a little bit less sophisticated, like the possibility of doing algorithmic bias is lower. Those states are typically less likely to have inequality. So now, given that we already know the level of inequality, we would like to know where the inequality comes from. So we can think about two components: the effect that comes from neighborhoods, so neighborhoods are taxed at different rates, and the effects that come from the individual themselves. So that's what we call within neighborhood variation. And how we decompose this, ideally, we would like to have a home, two homes together with exactly the same attributes and everything the same, just changing who the race of the owner is. That's not feasible, but we can do something similar. We can actually take the big jurisdiction and break it down into smaller neighborhoods and see what is the inequality that persists. The inequality that persists will be individual level inequality. So this is the overall inequality that I mentioned that we have found, that the 12 to 13% different assessment ratios. If we go to a smaller neighborhood, we see that this effect is breaks down in half. And if we actually get even smaller, you see this effect stabilizes. So we call this effect that persists the within neighborhood component or the homeowner component. So you are still facing higher taxation even within your own neighborhood. And the other one is 6 to 7% is going to be the between neighborhood component. So like the large difference in neighborhood is going to affect the taxation that is being presented. And now, why is that happening? So here you can see that these neighborhoods are quite different. So you have like the minority share is obviously different in these places. You have different levels of unemployment, SNAP benefit, homeowner percentage, Gini coefficient, and there's many other things. Like all these things are attributes of the neighborhood, not of the property in particular. This is not like things like number of bathrooms or square footage. But all these things affect market prices. So we can actually see how this impacts the market prices and the assessments. So what we see is we follow the same models that assessors follow. They follow something called hedonic prices. The important thing to know here is that the valuation of the home is going to be dependent upon upon neighborhood characteristics and upon characteristics of the home. So things like if you have a park close by, that affects the value of your property, but also the number of bedrooms in your home. And what I'm going to see is whether or not assessors are better at quantifying the market in some types of characteristics than in others, in particular in home characteristics against neighborhood characteristics. So this is what we're doing. We're just checking the value of the home against the attributes of the home. This is bedrooms, and this is in the attributes of the neighborhood. And then we can compare them. So the important thing here visually is that being close to zero means that the assessor is actually being accurate in their assessments. If you notice, for bathrooms, fireplace, like attributes of the home itself, these characteristics are very well done. So the assessors are good at pricing attributes of the home. But if you see attributes of the neighborhood, especially minority component, the assessors are not good at tracking that, which means that their methods are flawed, and those flawed systematically overtaxes minority communities. So lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the within variation component. Here is like why homeowners, even within neighborhoods that have the same characteristics, are overpaying. And there's many reasons to this, but I will explore one particular channel that is very important for all counties in the United States, and is that the prevalence of assessment appeals. So assessment appeals are very common throughout the United States. So we actually use data from the second largest county in the US, Cook County, and we have 3.5 million appeals over a population of 5 million people. And we have information in whether or not what are the appeals filed, the win-loss rate, and the amount of the reduction. And what we see is that Black and Hispanic mortgage holders are less likely to appeal. And this is consistent with evidence in other settings, like in health. We know that Blacks and Hispanics are more likely to distrust the health system. That has been shown repeatedly. So here we have evidence that is consistent with minorities being distrustful of the system to begin with. But even when they do appeal, they are less likely to win the appeal. And when they win the appeal, they get a smaller reduction. So we have a part of the systemic problem that is happening here for the individual homeowner is that the appeal system is not working in their favor. And we see that this is consistent with national data. If you see a white person selling to a black person or vice versa, when there's a change of race, you see that the growth rate of the assessment starts increasing. So it means like even in the same home, if it changes race, you start paying more taxes if you're a minority. If you have questions, I've done a lot of analysis to see whether or not this changes by racial animus, market, the value of the home, the income of the people. We can talk about that later. The last thing I just would like to mention is that these findings that we have, this inequality is something that can be corrected. It can be corrected with publicly available data. So how do we do this? So what we can do, if you are an assessor, you don't have to take race into account. That's dangerous. There's many reasons why you wouldn't want to do that, but you don't have to. You can do the following algorithm. The algorithm, what we would do is you set the first assessment to the market value of the home when it was sold the first time. And then you use the home price growth in that particular neighborhood over time. And then you have your second assessment just being a synthetic assessment, just adjusting by home price growth, and then you reset it every time you have a new sale. That's something that every assessor can do because that data on home price growth is available everywhere. What we do to compare to see whether or not this actually works, we just make this synthetic assessment, and then we compare it against the other assessments that we had, the real ones in the data, and we show that all the inequality that we document disappears. Moreover, it makes this assessment ratio become progressive rather than regressive. And even if this progressivity is not a desired feature, the progressivity here is a smaller degree than the regressivity that there was before. And assessors with better data than the one that is publicly available can do a better job to actually make sure that this inequality goes all the way to zero. So to conclude, I want you to remember three things from this study. First, that there's a 10 to 13% higher property tax burden for Black and Hispanics residents. Second, that there's two channels through which this happens. There's a geographic channel. That means that neighborhoods are paying more if they are largely minority. And there's an individual channel. It means that a minority person, regardless of their neighborhoods, ends up paying more. And the third point I want you to remember is this inequality can be easily corrected with publicly available data. And what is missing right now is just the political will to do so.
Okay, so fascinating stuff. We have plenty of time for questions. I have some, but let me see if any of you have your hands up if you want to dive in first. Okay, a couple of questions that I think I got a couple of questions on methods, because I think the reporters, the reporters who might be interested in covering this issue would want to know a little bit more about the actual data sets that you used. And you made reference to ATOM and HMDA and the ACS. I think some reporters have used the HMDA data and the American Community Survey. But could you just give us the definitions of what those two things are, and then also tell us what this ATOM data is? Yeah,
so the main one here is ATOM, but I will leave that to the end. The ACS is the most easily accessible data set here in this analysis. The ACS is the American Community Survey. Like it's just managed by census, the same way that they have the census data and the current population survey that is for unemployment, computing on, for example, the unemployment rate and so on. So all those data sets are publicly available, are handled by census. And what they give us that is important for this study, they have a lot of information. This is super rich and super fascinating. But for this study, what is important is give us two things. First, it gives us the minority share in each particular neighborhood, and for very specific, you can go to the tract level. You can actually go at higher geographies if you want. So we do, because we want to do something higher. The jurisdiction is bigger than the tract. So that's the first use of the ACS that is very important for us. The second is it gives us characteristics of that neighborhood. So it will give you things like unemployment rate. It will give you the inequality of the neighborhood, the homeowner percentage. There's a lot of information in the ACS that can be used. The second data set that we use is HMDA data. That's the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data. The Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data required that race was made available in the information, that race was recorded, because there were concerns, valid concerns, empirically documented concerns about inequality in lending. So you can use this data to actually use in other settings that are related to lending, because most homes are actually sold using a mortgage. Yeah, so what we use is you use that to get the information about the race of the homeowner, or the individual homeowner. And in addition to that, that data set also has the income of the homeowner, which is fairly useful as well. Then the last data set, which is the most important one here, is the ATOM data set. ATOM is the name of a vendor. So there's other vendors with this data. There's also a vendor called CoreLogic that has similar data. What these vendors do is they take all property tax records across the United States, and they harmonize them and put them together. You can get property tax record for a county, for example. At this level of national analysis, it's very hard to actually take all this, go FOIA everybody and put it all, harmonize all together, clean it up. So they already have done that job. And they also have transaction prices of all homes. So this data set is like puts together the main two components that we want to focus on: assessments and in property prices.
Okay, and the tax burden for the tax burden for people around the country outside of federal taxes, when it comes to state and local taxes, state and local income taxes, local property taxes, state and local property taxes, I'm sorry, sales taxes. So state and local income taxes, sales taxes, and property taxes. Do you have a general sense of, is the tax burden for the average person, is a property tax half of that or a third of that? Or I'm just trying to put it in perspective with the state taxes that people pay for income taxes and for sales.
So let me see, are you asking about the inequality or about the level of like of taxation?
Just like, yeah, the level of tax, the relative burden. I'm trying to, if I'm an editor or a reporter wanting to do this story, I want to know that, this property tax story is important because, the average citizen is paying, a third of their taxes are property taxes or something like that. I mean, do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, so I don't want to talk about nationally because I don't think it would be representative. If you think about Puerto Rico is the jurisdiction that pays the most sales tax in the United States. New Jersey is the one that pays the highest property taxes in a per capita basis. Texas only relies on property taxes to fund their analysis. So it's like it's very state dependent, I would say. So it's very jurisdiction dependent. So I would say Texas and New Jersey, if you're thinking about property taxes, are the main. Should be your main concern. In particular, New Jersey has levels of inequality that are fairly high. Yeah, so I don't like to compare them because they are very specific to different places.
Okay, so I mean, I'm just trying to conceptualize a story out of this. So for a while, I lived in Louisiana, high sales taxes, low property taxes. So this inequality that you're seeing will probably be less important to the average Louisianan than it would be in another state that has much higher property taxes relative to the the sales taxes or income taxes.
Exactly that, but also the home value of the property. So like the Louisiana home values are not very high relative to, for example, a state like California. California is not in this study for different reasons, but it has a high level of inequality. California has something called the Proposition 13 that embeds other levers that are not relevant to this study. So we are studying California in particular. But one problem with California is that the home prices are so large that these inequalities become extremely relevant rather than a place like Louisiana.
Okay. And I'm just sharing real quickly you all see in the slide, the assessment gap by state, which was slide 48 for you. I mean, if I were an editor and I looked at this chart, I'd say, if I were an editor in Illinois or Missouri or Ohio, I'd say, I got a story here. Two questions. Are the actual, we have these data on the chart here. Are the raw data available, the raw numbers available? So if a journalist wanted to look at this further, they could actually get the raw numbers that are behind this chart. And then this is just showing the kind of the relative difference between states. What would your suggestions be for a journalist who wants to take these, your relative differences, bad in Ohio, bad in Missouri, and make a story about the property tax system in their state? I mean, any suggestions on how to tackle this? Because you've kind of given us the spine for a great story, but they'll need to kind of execute it on a local level.
Yes, that's a great question. That's a question we have many times. So let me give you two answers. Like one that is immediately available, but it's difficult, and one that will be easier, but it won't be immediately available. So immediately, what you can do is just reach out directly to the county assessor. We have worked with many of these assessors in Cook County, Atlanta, and Wisconsin many times. So they have good data. They have good data that you can actually use to take both the assessments, and you can find the property price transactions available. The difficulty with this is you would have to FOIA, and I mean some county assessors are more responsive than others. So it would be a little bit, perhaps a little bit difficult, and then you have to find a statistician to do this. And then you can, once you do that, you can use the ACS data to see whether or not the minority records are, the minority shares in the neighborhoods correlate with these assessment ratios. So that's feasible, but it's going to be difficult. One part that is unlikely to be feasible is merging this data with HAMDA data, because this is a very sophisticated procedure that requires matching on loan level data, and that's not easily available. What I've been working with my co-author, working towards, and we expect to have at some point, we don't know when, we want to have an interactive map where we are able to disclose these findings that we have at a more county level. So that way it wouldn't require from either journalists, but also we work routinely with policymakers or with like lawyers, nonprofit organizations. It wouldn't require this effort from everybody. So we will plan to have an interactive map, and there will be two components there. First, the inequality in each county, but also decomposing that inequality into neighborhood and homeowner. And that matters quite a bit. I didn't have the time to emphasize that, but if you think a little bit from the perspective of a lawyer who's trying to redress this inequality, the argument that you can take to court will be very depending on where this is coming from. So if it comes from between neighborhood effects, it's very easy to have a legal defense that says these administrative processes of assessing are directly causing this direct impact. And you can build a case around that. And if you have like homeowner component, then you suspect then there's a problem with the appeal system. So we're planning to do that. So yeah, that's I believe like if we were able to do this decomposition in an interactive map, I think it would help more many stakeholders, but I think it's also feasible by requesting data directly from the county assessor's offices.
Okay, so I've just taken up a lot of the Q&A time, but we have more time for questions if anybody has one. Nick, we got a question or two from you.
Yeah, I mean, I had a very similar question to Chris, and it was more along the lines of, do you guys share your underlying data that you used for this study, so that way, so I cover Hawaii and the Pacific, and so if I wanted to say, hey, send me your data for Hawaii, is there a way? I mean, would you do that, and can I maybe work with you to sort of develop stories out of that? And then the second question I had has to do with more with if you've presented your findings to various assessors, and if you've gotten any sort of response from them to say, oh yeah, we've been screwing this up for years, let's go fix that.
So we actually, like, let me answer your first question first. We cannot give our data, not because we don't want to, it's because we are contractually bounded to protect the confidentiality of the data. This is delicate data, so the confidentiality of the people, once you have like the property, location, and race, is very hard to protect confidentiality. So we cannot. That's why we are thinking about providing this interactive map. It's taking time, and it will take also some negotiations. We're working with the vendors to have more relaxed restrictions. That is feasible, but giving the granular data is not going to be possible for understandable reasons. The second is, yes, we have actually worked with over 30 local, state, and even federal officers, and we have discussed this, and it's surprising. I mean, like, most of the people we talk to are people that are interested in changing the practices, because that's why they reach out to us. It's positive selection. In many of them were not aware of the problems. In some of them are minority. One of the people I talked to is Puerto Rican, like me. So it's not like there's actually an intention of holding the system as it is. But there's two problems. There's always inertia, but there's something worse than inertia that we've seen that is happening. And it's the fear of liability happening because they departed from what are the current most common practices. So like the IAAO, the International Association of Assessment Officers, defines what are the best standards for making assessments. And these standards are quite old. So this is like, they do not reflect a little bit the current practice in our, in the practice that will introduce the most equality into the system, that will reduce the inequalities. So in order to depart from this, from these guidelines, an assessor is fearful that if you find inequality, because there's already inequality there, it can be attributed to the fact that they changed from what is actually the current practice. So this plausible deniability is an important component that has become a political problem in making progress. That would be my interpretation. There's the will, many, actually would say the majority of the assessors that we have talked to, there's the will there. But we probably will need a little bit more, either from the International Association of Assessment Officers to update their practices, or perhaps for the federal government to actually establish new guidelines that will allow people to move to a more fair, more fair assessment practices without the threat of potential litigation because of the update in the practices.
Can I ask just a real quick follow-up question? So you said that lawyers and other stakeholders have been sort of looking at this study and this data, and I'm wondering, I mean, do you know of any lawsuits that have been filed anywhere, or any sort of potential litigation that might be on the horizon that, you know, some of us could be looking at for, you know, future stories coverage of this issue?
So I cannot tell you about the people have been talking to. It's fair that I protect that confidentiality. I know some people have been looking. I can tell you that nothing is advanced. You know, these things take time. I can also tell you that before this study, there have been cases trying to bring this issue, and the reason why these cases were not successful is because an analysis like the one that we're showing did not exist. So basically, you have two components to show in this type of litigation. We need to show disparate impact, but you need a causation element. It means that the government action is actually leading to that disparate impact. So if you show like there's like differences, but you can say, look, the intended level of taxation was different, that is enough for the government to not to defend themselves. So you have like the intention of the assessment practice. If you're not comparing apples to apples, it's not possible to actually provide this evidence. So there's many of these cases already in place that happened in the 2000s, and I can send Chris the cases if that's of interest. So now I think the move forward would be to actually create this link the way we did it, like just showing that the assessment themselves are not actually are not following the markets accurately.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, so thank you for sticking around for a few extra minutes of some more questions. Any other questions among the fellows out there? All right, well, I think, you know, as an investigative reporter on the local level, I kind of see the potential in this issue as being really dramatic. So I hope it might be possible for some local reporters to kind of dive into it at some point, because those property tax assessments form the basis of so much of what happens on the local level. So I want to thank you for kind of showing us, although your methods are very sophisticated, far more sophisticated than most of us will ever be able to accomplish. I think you've given us a good idea of what is possible, and it's possible to cover this issue with the assistance of researchers such as yourself. So Carlos, I want to thank you very much. And thanks for your time. Thanks for the PowerPoint, and thanks for the fascinating research.